For 8 long years, Tobias Redmont had spoken only to his horses and the wind. No visitors, no letters, no one calling his name across the porch. Just the hush of solitude, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood or the distant howl of coyotes that didn't care whether he lived or died. It wasn't that he hated people. He simply no longer trusted the world that had taken everything from him. Outside, the storm had gathered like a reckoning. Rain slashed sideways against the windows, tapping a steady rhythm like fingers drumming on a coffin. Inside, Tobias sat alone by the fire, mending a worn leather saddle strap. He didn't notice how long he'd been staring at the same stitch until the knock came. Not a casual tap. Not someone asking for directions or a neighbor checking in. It was sharp, urgent, and just loud enough to be heard over the wind. He froze. It had been so long since anyone knocked on that door that the sound felt unreal, like something remembered from a dream. Then came the second knock, and this time a voice, not in English, not from a man. A woman's voice broken by the wind, low and hoarse, and then, just barely, a baby's cry. Tobias's hand went still on the leather. He hadn't heard a baby cry in years, not since the night everything had ended. He rose slowly, heart thudding. The sound of the storm filled the room, but beneath it he could still hear her. A woman standing in the rain, holding something small and fragile, something alive. He stepped toward the door but didn't touch the handle. Not yet, because some voices bring back the dead, and some knocks open more than a door. And if you were Tobias, standing there, alone in the dark, with a the door groaned as it opened, resisting like a memory best left buried. Tobias didn't know what he expected to see. Maybe one person, desperate and alone. Maybe a trick. Maybe nothing at all. But what he found standing on his porch would haunt him more than any ghost. 10 women, Apache, soaked to the bone, their dresses clinging to them like tattered flags of a lost nation. Mud streaked their faces, but not shame. Wounds bled through thin fabric, but they didn't flinch. And at the center of them, standing just a step ahead as if she bore the weight of them all, was a woman with silver woven into her hair and fire etched into her eyes. She said nothing at first, just held his gaze. In her arms, wrapped in layers of damp cloth, was a child, small, still, and barely breathing. The baby's lips were pale, its chest rose only shallowly. And in that instant, Tobias felt the weight of the moment settle like a stone in his chest. Behind them, the wind howled like it was trying to warn him. These weren't just travelers caught in a storm. These were hunted women, running from something dark and merciless. He didn't need to ask. He'd seen that look before, long ago in another life, in a different war, on faces that knew what it meant to be pursued. Still, his fingers hovered near the door frame. Letting them in wasn't a small thing. Letting them in could mean opening his life to danger all over again. But turning them away wasn't an option either. Not when he looked down and saw a girl no older than 16 clutching the hand of her younger sister, or when his eyes landed on the woman in front whose arm bore a deep cut still weeping blood. The leader stepped forward, the baby trembling against her chest. Her voice was low, measured, but heavy with truth. "They are coming," she said. "If we stay out here, we die. If you take us in, they will come for you too." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And yet there was no malice in her tone, only the weight of knowledge. Tobias looked at them, then past them into the darkness where he imagined riders creeping closer, closing in. He thought of the last time someone had come to his door in the middle of the night, how he'd opened it, how he'd lost everything by morning. But this felt different. These women weren't just fleeing, they were fighting to live. His hand tightened on the door. His voice came low, almost surprised by its own certainty. "Come inside." They filed in silently, like shadows obeying the shape of light. As the last one passed, Tobias caught the faint scent of blood, fear, and something else, resolve. When he slid the bar back into place behind them, the sound was final. Whatever storm they had brought with them, it had found a place to rest. And so had the man who once vowed never to open his door again. The fire crackled softly behind them, casting flickering shadows against the cabin walls as the storm outside settled into a steady rhythm. The women huddled together near the hearth, tending to wounds and whispering words Tobias didn't understand but somehow felt. He stood apart, one hand on the rifle above his mantle, the other hanging uselessly by his side, like it didn't quite know what to do now that it had opened the door. 8 years. That's how long it had been since he'd last let anyone in, physically or otherwise. He used to live for the sound of laughter in this room. His daughter used to dance barefoot across this very floor, trailing ribbons and dust. Sarah, his wife, would scold her gently, eyes warm with that soft kind of love that made a man feel like he belonged to something larger than himself. Then came that night, a knock on the door, friendly at first. Soldiers claiming they were lost, needing food, warmth. Tobias had believed them, offered them stew and shelter. By morning, his daughter's body lay broken in the garden, Sarah's blood soaked into the floorboards where she'd tried to fight back. The soldiers never looked back. Since then, he hadn't opened the door. Not for rain, not for wanderers, not for neighbors. He became a shadow, haunting the edge of town, living in silence with guilt as his only company. But tonight's knock hadn't come with swagger. It came with desperation. It came with a baby's cry and a woman's cracked voice barely holding together. He glanced toward the group near the fire. One of the older women was whispering something to the girl with the wounded leg, her voice as gentle as any mother's lullaby. Another gently wiped the mud from the baby's face, trying to warm the child's tiny hands with her breath. There was no violence in them, but the storm that followed them, that would be different. Still, something inside Tobias stirred, something that had been sealed off, entombed behind grief and rage. A memory of Sarah's voice echoed faintly in his mind, like wind through broken windows. "Kindness," she once said, "is what separates us from the animals." He had forgotten that. Or maybe he'd buried it so deep he'd convinced himself it never mattered. But tonight, as thunder rolled over the hills and strangers sat drying their bones in the warmth of his home, Tobias realized something was changing. Not outside. Inside, he was no longer the man who chose silence out of pain. He had answered a knock again. And this time maybe it wasn't a mistake. She introduced herself simply, Ayana. No last name, no rank, just a name spoken in clear English that carried both caution and conviction. Her voice didn't waver, even with blood trickling down her temple and exhaustion drawn deep in her face. "These are my sisters," she said. "My daughters, my people. We've been running for 3 days." Tobias had seen soldiers in the war break after too. He studied her in the firelight. Her shoulders were squared not in pride, but in protection. She moved like someone used to leading, not asking. And though her dress was torn and her hands scraped raw, she carried herself like a woman who had already buried fear and replaced it with purpose. These women were not what he had assumed, lost, frightened, desperate refugees. No. That illusion fell away the moment Ayana shifted her stance and reached beneath the folds of her skirt to draw a blade wrapped in cloth. Tobias didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The blade wasn't for him. "I know what you think," she said, eyes locked with his. "That we're broken, that we're here to beg, but we've fought harder than the men who hunted us. And we came here not because we were weak, but because we chose where this ends." He didn't know what startled him more, the knife, or the way the other women subtly moved in unison, positioning themselves around the cabin. Some near windows, others closer to the baby, not frantic, not panicked, deliberate, coordinated. This wasn't a group that had stumbled blindly into danger. This was a war party, quiet, precise, and deadly if provoked. Tobias's eyes returned to Ayana. He saw, for the first time, the outline of an old scar just above her collarbone, something long healed but never forgotten. Her hands were calloused, her knuckles worn. She had known labor, survival, perhaps even blood. He realized then that she hadn't brought her people here for mercy. She had brought them here to finish something. The difference was profound. And Tobias, man of the earth, rancher of no one, ghost in his own home, felt something stir in him again. Not pity, not fear, respect. In Ayana he saw not a victim but a leader. As the firelight danced across the cabin walls, Ayana sat with the baby cradled gently in her arms, speaking in a low voice meant only for Tobias and for the ghosts listening in the corners. "There were 40 of us," she said, "before Morrison came." The name dropped like lead between them. She didn't raise her voice, didn't curse or spit, but each word she spoke felt sharpened by memory. Tobias could see it, flashes of fire licking the edges of a village, smoke curling through trees, men in uniform shouting orders as homes collapsed under torch and steel. She didn't need to paint the whole picture. The war had taught Tobias enough to fill in the rest. "He called us hostile," Ayana continued, "said we were threats to settlers, but the only thing we threatened was his reputation. One of us saw what he did, my youngest sister." Her jaw tightened. Tobias didn't ask what exactly the soldier had done. The silence between Ayana's words was answer enough. He looked down at the baby in her arms. Barely 2 months old, swaddled in scraps of what had once been her mother's shawl. Her skin was pale from cold, her eyes wide and unfocused, but she breathed, fragile and steady. "She hasn't cried since we left," Ayana murmured. "Not even when we ran through thorns, not even when the others bled." Tobias swallowed hard. In war, silence in a child wasn't peace, it was survival. And now the child lay between two impossible truths. If Tobias gave them shelter, Morrison would come for him. That wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. The army didn't forgive interference. And Tobias, once labeled enemy of the state, would be hunted down again. But if he turned them away, what then? A baby left to die in the cold, a woman forced to walk back into the mouth of the beast, and Tobias, safe behind a door that meant nothing anymore. His mind drifted to Sarah again. How she used to say, "There's always a moment, Tobias. A single one where you decide who you are, and sometimes it comes dressed in rags." He didn't say a word, just stood there, the storm softening outside, while thunder still rumbled in his chest. The door was already shut, but now something else was opening, something deeper. This wasn't just about choosing safety over danger. It was about choosing who to stand beside. Beneath the creaking floorboards, under years of dust and forgotten resolve, Tobias pried open a cabinet he'd sworn never to touch again. Inside lay the tools of a man he used to be: rusted bare traps, coils of wire, old Union-issued caltrops, a rifle wrapped in oiled cloth, and sticks of dynamite still tucked in canvas rolls. He hadn't built this place to be a home. He'd built it to survive. Now, for the first time in years, he realized that survival wasn't about hiding. It was about choosing what to stand for. Ayanna watched him, silent but unflinching. Her people moved quietly around the cabin, taking instruction without words. They didn't ask what he was doing. They understood. This wasn't just about shelter anymore. This was war, or something deeper, a reckoning. Tobias laid the traps outside in the mud where soldiers might charge, reinforced the windows with shelves pulled from the pantry. Every movement was methodical, almost familiar, as if his body remembered what his heart had long tried to forget. As the storm lightened outside, tension thickened within. No one spoke of mercy. No one claimed they wanted blood. But they all knew, if Morrison and his men came, the floorboards would not remain dry. "I didn't want this," Tobias muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Ayanna stood beside him, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes. "None of us did." He paused, "But we're still doing it." She nodded, "Because they won't stop. And because we're tired of running." He looked around. The cabin, once his tomb of grief, now breathed again, not with peace but with purpose. These women had come here not to die, but to make dying mean something if it came to that. And somehow that gave the place life. Tobias lit a lantern and set it near the window, a beacon or maybe a warning. The trap had been set. The final boundary had been crossed. This wasn't just a defense. It was a declaration. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was choosing. And if he had to bleed to buy these women a future, so be it. Because sometimes a cabin built from guilt can still stand for something good. The first boot hit the porch like a gavel. Then came the voice, arrogant, certain, dripping with the kind of confidence only cruelty wears. "I know you're in there," Morrison shouted. "Come out now and we'll make this quick." Tobias stayed still, crouched by the window, rifle in hand. He counted at least 6 men moving through the dark, the shapes of their bodies just beyond the torchlight. There were more too many for a fair fight. But fairness was never part of this night. Inside, Ayanna stood like a statue carved from shadow. She said nothing, blade in hand, eyes fixed on the door. Around her, the women moved into position, quiet, practiced, lethal. The door exploded inward. Morrison stepped in, gun drawn, expecting fear, begging, maybe even surrender. What he saw instead was Tobias, calm and armed, and Ayanna behind him. Steady, silent, eyes locked not on the gun, but on Morrison's throat. He hesitated, just one heartbeat, and that was all she needed. The flash of steel was faster than thought. Morrison spun to face her, but Ayanna was already behind him, silent as breath. "This is for my sister," she whispered. The blade slid between ribs like it belonged there. Morrison's rifle dropped before he did. Tobias felt something cold crawl down his spine. Not fear, but awe. She didn't flinch, didn't scream. She just watched him fall, her face unreadable, her hands steady. Around them, the house erupted into chaos. Blades meeting flesh, muffled shouts, thudding boots in mud. Morrison's men had walked into a trap disguised as helplessness, and they were paying the price for every life they'd discounted. Tobias moved through the cabin like a man reborn, no longer just defending, fighting beside people who refused to die quietly. Every shot he fired, every trap that snapped was part of something bigger now. Not revenge, justice. And it wasn't delivered from a courtroom. It came from women who had nothing left to lose. From a rancher who had lost everything and decided it wasn't too late to matter. When Morrison gasped his last breath, the cabin fell still for a single second, just enough to feel the shift. Justice had arrived, and her name was... The plan had been brutal but clean. Blow the dam. Let the storm-swollen water rush down the valley and swallow every last soldier that came hunting them. No bullets, no bloodshed, just a wall of justice delivered by nature itself. Tobias had prepped the charges himself. His hands moved without hesitation, like the old days, back when he carved mountains to make railways for men he didn't respect. But now, it wasn't about trains. It was about ending a pursuit that would never stop unless they ended it. He was halfway to the back door, dynamite slung across his chest when it came. A sound. Soft at first, then sharper. A cry. But not the faint whimper of the baby Ayanna held inside. This was different further off. Higher pitched, fearful. Another child. Tobias froze. Ayanna turned to him, tense. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because he knew that cry. Not the voice itself, but the truth behind it. It was the same kind of scream he hadn't heard in 8 years, the kind he'd buried with his daughter. That unmistakable sound of a child crying not for attention, but for life. The others heard it too. One of Ayanna's women cursed under her breath. They brought a child. Ayanna's eyes darkened. Could be a trick. "Maybe," Tobias muttered, his hand tightening on the fuse rope. "But I've heard enough cries to know when one's real." Panic and memory collided inside him. The trap they'd set, the dam, the flood, was no longer a tactic. It had become a line. If he crossed it, he wouldn't just be killing soldiers. He'd be drowning a child, and he couldn't do it, not again. "We can't blow the dam," he said, voice low, firm. "Then we all die," someone hissed. "No," he shook his head, already ripping the canvas from his shoulder, dropping the explosives. "There's another way. There has to be." Ayanna stared at him, torn between fury and understanding. Around them, the night pressed in closer, darker, but that cry still cut through it. A small, fragile sound holding back the floodgates of vengeance. Tobias remembered Sarah's last words, the way she shielded their daughter, the way she screamed when he hesitated, too slow to stop what came next. He wouldn't hesitate this time. They were still in danger, still outnumbered, still surrounded. But now everything had changed, because somewhere out there in the storm was a child, one that didn't get to choose which side their father fought on. And Tobias Redmont, man of guilt, of silence, of second chances, refused to let another innocent die just so he could feel righteous. Not this time. The storm had dulled to a cold drizzle, but the night was far from quiet. Through the fog and smoke, Tobias crawled across the mud, heart pounding like a war drum. Somewhere between the cabin and the outer ring of soldiers was the baby, still crying, somewhere close, somewhere helpless. Then he saw it. A military supply wagon tucked between two trees, canvas flapping in the wind. And beside it, hunched and shaking, was a woman. She wasn't armed, wasn't a soldier, just a girl really, maybe 19, wearing the heavy apron of a camp cook, her hands raw from work, her eyes wide with terror. The baby lay in a worn sling across her chest, tiny arms curled against the cold. She looked up as Tobias approached, didn't scream, didn't run, just clutched the child tighter and whispered, "Please don't hurt her, she's all I have." "I'm not here to hurt you," Tobias said gently, lowering his rifle. "What's your name?" "Mary," she whispered. "Mary Hendricks, I just cook. They told me it was safe, that we were going to arrest thieves. I didn't know." Her voice cracked. Tobias didn't need her to finish. He looked at the baby, the same age his daughter would have been had she lived. And just like that, the layers of time peeled back. For the first time in years, he didn't see himself as the man who'd lost everything. He saw the man who still had something left to give. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said, "but you have to listen to me." Mary nodded. "When the shooting starts again, run for those trees." He pointed toward the woods. "There's a creek on the other side. Follow it south. It'll lead you to a trading post 5 miles down. Tell them Tobias Redmont sent you." "What about you?" she asked. Tobias didn't answer. Instead, he reached down, adjusted the baby's blanket, and smiled, something he hadn't done in years. "Not like this. Not for someone else. You don't need to worry about me," he said. As he turned to leave, the baby reached a hand toward him, fingers curling around empty air. It was a tiny gesture, insignificant, but something in Tobias shifted. He wasn't just defending a cabin anymore, or fighting ghosts, or settling debts. He was saving lives. He was making a choice, not to die for something, but to live for someone. And in that muddy clearing, with thunder rumbling in the distance and innocence clinging to a cook's apron, Tobias Redmont became something he hadn't been in years. A man worth remembering. The storm had ebbed to a hush, but inside the cabin the tension had only thickened. Two of Ayana's women lay still in the mud, their blood seeping into the wooden floor. But they'd done what they came to do, held the line, saved the rest. And then from the shadows, Ayanna emerged with a blade to a boy's throat. Not a soldier, not a monster, a boy. He wore a lieutenant's uniform, barely wrinkled, barely bloodied, too new to know how fast things die in war. His eyes darted between Ayanna and Tobias, wide with disbelief, with confusion that couldn't decide whether to harden or collapse. "This is Colonel Bradley's son," Ayanna said, voice flat. "He came through the back, thought he was being clever." The boy trembled, his voice a whisper. "I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Tobias asked, stepping closer. "What Morrison did, what your father covered up, that the raiders you're chasing were farmers and mothers and children." The boy's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't have the words, just the dawning awareness of betrayal. The kind that makes your skin itch with shame, your stomach twist with something worse than guilt. "I thought we were protecting settlers," he said softly. "I thought we were stopping violence." Ayanna's blade pressed closer. "Your father lied, your captain murdered. Your uniform is soaked in blood you never saw." Tobias held up a hand. "Oh, wait." She looked at him. "Don't kill him," Tobias said. "Not yet." Ayanna's jaw tightened. "He doesn't deserve mercy," she snapped. "No," Tobias agreed. "But maybe he deserves purpose." He turned to the boy. "You want to make this right?" he asked. "Then speak. Tell the truth. Testify. Tell them what you saw, what your father did, what Morrison really was." The boy blinked. "You want me to betray my family?" "No," Tobias said. "I want you to save someone else." Outside, voices barked orders. More soldiers, more danger. The circle was closing fast. But in that moment, in that suffocating cabin soaked with the weight of stories unspoken, a different kind of weapon had been found. Not a gun, not a blade, but a truth. The boy nodded, voice shaking. "Tell me what to say." Ayanna lowered her knife. And for the first time in a very long time, Tobias believed. The first light of dawn spilled across the valley like a second kind of justice. Soft, relentless, irrefutable. Smoke from the night's chaos still lingered in the air, but the gunfire had stopped. The shouting, the running, the terror. It had all dissolved into a silence far more powerful than noise. Colonel Bradley was in chains, led away by the very men who once saluted him. His face, so firm in command the night before, now hung in disbelief, defeated not by bullets but by the testimony of his own son. A boy who had seen the truth and chosen to speak it aloud. Ayanna stood by the gate with the other survivors, their wounds bound, their eyes set on the northern trail. There were others waiting for them, relatives, safe ground, the promise of rebuilding. Tobias walked beside her, hands still bandaged, body heavy, but heart clearer than it had been in years. "You'll go with them?" Ayanna asked, nodding toward Mary and the baby, already preparing their modest wagon. "I will," he said. "The trail west isn't kind to women traveling alone." Ayanna didn't smile, not fully, but something in her eyes softened. "You're not the man who opened that door last night." "No," he said. "He died somewhere between the thunder and the fire." Together they turned to look at the cabin, Tobias's home for nearly a decade. The place where he buried his voice, his past, and for a long time his reason for living. It stood crooked now, scorched in places, quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. I used to think that cabin kept me safe, Tobias murmured, but it just kept me alone. Ayana said nothing, letting the silence agree with him. He took one last look at the crooked porch, the shutter that never hung quite right, the fence half swallowed by weeds. And then he turned away. Because home, he had finally learned, isn't walls or firewood or familiar floors. Home is where your choices live. And by the time the sun had fully risen, the man who had spent 8 years hiding from the world no longer existed. In his place stood someone reborn, not because he had won a fight, but because he had chosen to face it at all. A man who fought not for vengeance, but for protection, who carried both pain and mercy in equal measure. It wasn't victory that made him a hero. It was the choice he made when no one would have blamed him for staying behind that locked door. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't choosing between right and wrong. It's choosing to stay human when the world begs you to forget how.